All right. I
Okay.
Hello, Paisley. Welcome. I'm Dr. Dowdero. I'm talking with Dr. Littleface right now. She's in the classroom trying to get her virtual link set up. Thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Great. How are you doing?
I'm going to turn on my video here. I'm doing very well. We're just trying to get this whole link thing straightened out for the classroom.
Do you mind if I just grab like a cup of tea then? Okay.
Totally fine. Go right ahead, Paisley. Yeah, you're fine. Thank you. Hello, Dr. Rekdal, and all those of you joining me virtually. Hey, this is Dr. Dowdero for anyone who may not know me. We're having a irresolvable issue in the classroom. There's some kind of our tech person is trying to resolve it, but she's not having an easy time. We're hoping to get it resolved by the evening so that this is absolutely not a problem for the evening reading. To us, that's definitely a
Sorry.
priority.
Sure.
I apologize deeply for the inconvenience and the issue, Dr. Rekdal. So students, those of you who joined us by Zoom today, thank you for coming. Thank you for reading Dr. Rekdal's work. I hope that you're able to join us at 6 p.m. for her full reading and Q&A in the evening. And Dr. Rekdal, again, thank you for making time with us. I know it's particularly difficult for you with the time zone as well.
That's not a problem. So does that mean there's only 8 students that I'm talking to?
Right now, you are talking to 8 students. The classroom students are not connected. They're not able to connect.
Oh, that's too bad. Okay.
So these are our virtual participants who are meeting you from Tifton as well as our campus.
Okay.
And we have some professors on right now as well.
All right. Well, I'm happy to talk about anything to do with the writing life, any of my poems, being a poet laureate, anything to do with anything at this point.
Okay, let's see if anyone has any questions they want to put in the chat. I'm going to see if I'm able to unmute my attendees and let them speak. There we go. So everyone, as Dr. Rekdal was so kind to invite you all, if you have questions for her about the writing process, about poetry, she's a poet as well as a prose author, please feel free to ask.
I'm also happy just to sort of give a quick background. I'm assuming most people don't even know who I am. So I can also just talk about who I am and where I come from and all that sort of stuff. And would
Please do. Please do.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Rekdal.
Okay, so my name is Paisley Rekdal. I'm a distinguished professor here at the University of Utah. I've been here since 2003. I've also been the Utah Poet Laureate for the last 4 years, actually now heading on to 5. And I'm the author of about 10 collections of poems and essays, the most recent of which for poetry is called Nightingale, which retells in a very bizarre way Ovid's Metamorphoses. So I can talk about adaptation and translation, that kind of way. And I'm also the author of a book of prose called Appropriate or Appropriate, a Provocation. And that's about cultural appropriation in literature. I was born and raised in Seattle. Half my family is Chinese on my mother's side. The other half is a mixture of European white, mostly Norwegian on my father's side. So I spent most of my life actually in the West, whether it's in Seattle or it's in Utah and Wyoming. I was living in Wyoming where I was teaching there prior to the University of Utah, but I've kind of lived all over the world, including Korea and Japan, Vietnam, and France. So my work is a little strange in the sense that I actually started out as a poet fairly late, though I did write poetry when I was in high school because I was interested in it. But I didn't really think I was ever going to go into poetry. I was interested in trying to become an editor. I wanted to be the editor. When I was 16, my greatest desire was to be the editor of Harper's Magazine. That did not happen. And I was going to go and pursue journalism. And then I got into college and I got interested in classics. I took Latin in high school, which is why I've always been interested in myths and things like that, and retelling myths in very contemporary kinds of ways. So then I went to the University of Washington. I started doing classics and mostly medieval literature as my background as an English degree. And then I thought I would go into medieval studies. So this is actually what I think made me a poet more than anything else, is that I started reading medieval visionary women's literature, and those are just these absurd and crazy and beautiful poems. But then I was also interested in the scholarship of Carolyn Bynum, and I was so interested in how she would take sort of threads from art history, theology, the history itself, literature, and sort of weave them together into a really kind of rich and compelling portrait of something very surprising. And that's something I try to do with my poems as well. Like, I often write about my own personal life, but I put them against other sort of narratives that come out of history or science or some other literary kind of movement, sort of to think about not only who I am, but where I stand in a longer conversation. So that's one of the reasons I was really attracted to Ovid's Metamorphoses. I had actually been going through a period of writer's block. I was not able to sort of come up with anything new. And so I sat down and I started writing sort of fun retellings of myths that I was very familiar with from having read the Metamorphoses, but also just having been a classics person nut. But I wanted to contemporize them very much. And so I took out the gods and goddesses and I really focused in on specific situations that current people would experience. So there's a lesbian couple, one woman becomes suddenly disabled, radically disabled. There's another person whose son is, or daughter is transitioning to being a son. Sort of medically fully a son in that sense. There's stories about rape. And that was one of the reasons why I discovered that I was actually writing about Ovid, which is that I was rewriting a current story of Philomela, thinking about a woman who had been in Greek and then Roman mythology raped and then her tongue cut out. But I rewrote it just to sort of describe a young woman who is still living with this sort of, traumatic sexual assault. But when I was working on that, I sort of was not happy with the poem. And so I sat down and I started trying to figure out what I'd left out of that revision. And any snoring you hear is actually my dog. I just got a dog. Anyway, so I ended up writing all of the things that had been left out in that myth. And it turns out to have been quite a lot, including what had happened to me when I was 20, that I'd been sexually assaulted as well, something I had not really ever confessed or thought about much. I mean, I thought about it, but I didn't want to actually think about it. So I think about all of the ways in which Ovid's retelling of Philomela kind of worked its way through Shakespeare, through Keats, through so many other poets. Ted Hughes, dozens of women poets have also picked up on that trope and sort of thought about what is the relationship between violence and voicelessness. What is the relationship between song and art and trauma? And that's what Nightingale is about. But I'm now, as poet laureate, I was asked to write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad for its 150th commemoration, its completion, because completion took place in Utah. And so I created a documentary and multimedia poem web archive, and I can show you some of that. I'm going to be performing parts of that tonight, if Zoom works, because it actually works well on this kind of medium, because it's filled with videos and things like that. So that's me in like a real bit quick nutshell.
It's interesting to me, or maybe it shouldn't be, but it seems you're an incredible example of a poet who is really using poetry to engage with the past, the present, and the future, maybe simultaneously. Can you talk a little bit about how you envision doing that in this transcontinental?
Yeah, let me share my screen if I can do that. Hopefully that'll work. Yeah. So I'll show you some examples of that. So like all of us, I was conscious and awake, unpleasantly so, for the last 5 years. And there were many things that kind of came up in politics and in culture that I think a lot of people would be pretty upset about. So when I was doing the research of the Transcontinental Railroad, I was reading nothing but 19th century sources. And I'll say a little bit about what I created here and then moving between the past and present. And I'll show you a poem that specifically does that, exactly that. So when I was reading all this stuff about the Transcontinental, and like I said, I was reading nothing but 19th century sources. I was reading travel logs. I was reading etiquette guidebooks because the train, let me just back up. Those of you who are aware of the railroad, there's literally not one part of American culture that the Transcontinental and the idea of railroads did not change fundamentally. Our idea of time, the way that men and women would interact with each other in public, race relations on transportation, immigration law, all sorts of things. And while I was doing this kind of research, I was trying to figure out how to contain all the information I was reading. And I was also reading the poems that had been carved into the walls of Angel Island Immigration Station, which is the Ellis Island of the West, where Chinese migrants during the Chinese Exclusion Act, which took place 13 years after the Transcontinental was completed, and lasted to 1943, that's where they were detained. And the Chinese Exclusion Act definitely affected my family and the history of my family. But I was thinking that actually to write about the railroad was also to write about the Chinese Exclusion Act, because of course, during the building of the railroad, everyone wanted Chinese people to come and work on the railroad. After the railroad is finished, of course, they were like, we don't want this cheap labor because it is in fact a threat to white labor. So they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what I did, and I won't play the opening video, but I'll just sort of say, like, because I'll play it tonight, this is the A.J. Russell's famous East and West meeting. And then all you're going to hear is like all of these people speaking all of these different languages to represent the different ethnic and national groups that worked on the railroad. And then at the end, a man reading in Cantonese the poem that was carved into Angel Island. And this is the poem that was carved into Angel Island. I don't know if you can see it very well.
Yeah.
But each character opens into a poem about the railroad, a worker's history, aspects of American history that are going on sort of at that time, and their videos and their documentary poems. But so this is one where I found myself weaving together past and present, because what was really surprising to me was how much of what was happening in 2019, 2018, 2017, when I was working on this, was also happening right around the time of the building of the Transcontinental.
Yeah, just start there, like to the end exam.
Okay, we had.
Yeah, somebody emailed her and asked her.
Okay, I have no idea what was going on there. Okay. So we have presidential impeachment, we have a cholera epidemic, we have anti-Chinese sentiment, we have major arguments about labor and fights about labor, all these sorts of things. So I created, one of the things that I was interested in was the presidential impeachment thing. So Andrew Johnson was president while the Transcontinental was being built in the early stages. And of course, Donald Trump was president when I was writing this. And Andrew Johnson was taking a thing called the Swing Around the Circle train tour, which he was stumping for various Democratic candidates. And he was called a drunken demagogue. He was considered illiterate. He was reviled by the press. And in fact, in 1866, the Potter County Journal wrote, if he would just stay in the White House, keep his mouth shut and not make a fool of himself, disgusting friend and foe alike, the President of the United States might command some respect. So on this contrapuntal, I decided to use the speeches from Andrew Johnson on the left-hand side and the speeches from President Trump on the right-hand side. You can read each one as its individual poem, or you can read them together. And what's really sad is they work very well together. So I'll demonstrate this. I'll read Johnson first, then Trump, and then I'll read them together. At this particular crisis of the American people, I cling to the Constitution. Notwithstanding a mendacious press, that common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers, the pains Congress has taken to malign what all patriotic men should rally round, there is no power that can control me. Before I would see this government destroyed, I would send every Negro back to Africa. I will indeed be your Moses. There are a good many people, but this is a country for white men, hence you can see why I've been assaulted. I hand over to you this flag, though imprisoned. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine. If these are your tender mercies, God. And this is Trump. We have shattered the mentality, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Nobody's done anything like I've been able to do. I alone can fix that strong border. They want a wall, that Chinese virus, I call it, because when somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total to silence your voices on social media. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, sad. And then you get into legal semantics on both sides. So we had a campaign. Sorry, women, thank you for that big victory. It's called total acquittal, and now I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat, except for possibly Abe Lincoln. Trust me, there will be no lies. At this particular crisis, we have shattered the mentality of the American people. I cling to the Constitution, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Notwithstanding a mendacious press, nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. That common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers, I alone can fix the pains Congress has taken to malign that strong border. They want a wall, what all patriotic men should rally round, that Chinese virus, I call it, because there is no power that can control me. When somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total. Before I would see this government destroyed to silence your voices on social media, I would send every Negro back to Africa. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, sad. I will indeed be your Moses. And then you get into legal semantics. There are a good many people on both sides. So we had a campaign, but this is a country for white men. Sorry, women, thank you for that big victory. Hence, you can see why I've been assaulted. It's called total acquittal. And now I hand over to you this flag, though imprisoned. I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, except for possibly Abe Lincoln. If these are your tender mercies, God, trust me, there will be no lies. So, this is what I mean by putting the past in conversation with the present. None of this is my language. I mean, none of it. And that I actually found it weirdly cathartic, actually, to spend time in the 19th century at a point of real crisis, because of course they're coming off of the Civil War, which totally shattered the nation. And to a certain extent, we are in our own, I won't call it a civil war because I don't want to elevate that at all, but I do think we're at a sort of crisis point where we really do have people who are not seeing some of the same information or refusing to agree on some of the information that we are seeing, which makes it really hard for people to have a conversation. So I thought that it was, when we're working in the 19th century, it actually made me feel slightly better. Like, this was a time of incredible division and difficulty, illness and job insecurity and racial reckoning, as they were trying to figure out what to do after, freeing the slaves and trying to remake a country in a better image of itself. And, if they can survive and crawl forward, it kind of made me feel like we can survive and crawl forward too. At the same time, it made me think of history as a kind of spiral, that we continue to have so many of the same debates and arguments and so many of the same, anxieties that just plague us, and the same issues around racism and immigration just keep coming back. So anyway, that's an example of that.
Thank you. I love that in this particular example that you showed us, it's the present that maybe has the power through you, through the poet, to juxtapose history and the present in ways that tell a story and tell us a story about ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if people sort of imagine that we're at a time that has never been, that's just utterly unusual, that just came out of nowhere, I thought that was very useful to see some of these documents to sort of say, actually, no, these sentiments don't come out of nowhere. They're baked into American politics. They've been there. Even if we don't recognize them or we don't remember them, that doesn't mean that they weren't there, that they didn't lay a foundation for these sentiments to arise again and again and again.
So those of you listening and watching who are joining us, feel free. You have the ability, if you would like, to pose a question or maybe engage with Dr. Rekdal about the poem that she just shared with you. Feel free. You can unmute yourself, you can ask, or you can raise your hand if you would like to be called on. The button is at the bottom of your webinar screen. And while we're waiting for anyone to come up with a question, I do hope that maybe you can talk to our students, because I see a lot of our students are in English and Comm, those who have joined us. And I recognize some really brilliant creative writers in the crowd. And so I wonder if you could talk to them a little bit about what you see as the role of the poet.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out as well. And I can also say, if people want to know, I imagine some people might actually be interested in, say, becoming a writer or going into academia or something like that. So if you're interested in me talking about that, I'm more than happy to talk about that as well. I mean, it's funny, the question about what I see as the role of the poet, because before I was poet laureate, I really had a very different idea about poetry, which is that primarily it's pursued for one's own interest, that it's a very private occupation, that it's there to not affect any kind of change, not do any kind of social kind of work. And largely I still think that's pretty true. I think the best poems do tend to be written with a larger, longer eye towards privacy and history. But I would say that being poet laureate, has been asked to do a lot of occasional poems, like obviously West is one of them. And I've had to rethink this, which is, does poetry have the ability to communicate parts of history that maybe people aren't going to see otherwise because they're just going to think it's too dry? Does poetry have the ability to reinterpret history, to translate history in ways that people can feel like they're more touched by? And I have some poems like that I can show you from the site as well. Like I did some interviews with hobos, riders that ride the train, and some of the stories that I heard there I thought were really quite moving. Poetry is an engagement between people, even if the people never see each other, like the writer and the reader. But, two people who love the same poem are also sort of sharing something there too. And I think that any art that makes us spend more time considering the powerful effect that words have on us, I think is just a good thing. So we see that there is a question. So Skyla asks, I know this is not related directly to the poem itself, but how did you become the Poet Laureate of Utah? How did that come about? Good question. So what they do is, and I think almost every state does this now, they sort of either they have an open call, which they didn't hear really, but basically there were nominations from previous poet laureates to sort of say like who would be a good poet laureate, and then they contact the 8 or 9 people whose names have been put forward and say, do you want to apply? And and I was friends with a number of people who were asked to apply, and I did, I actually was hoping a friend of mine was going to get it. I thought it would be really important for her to get it. And so, but I put my application in anyway, just in case. And I said, I wanted to create a web archive of Utah writers past and present. And I can show you that project as well. It's called Mapping Literary Utah. And I'm really proud of that site. And they chose me, which was a bit of a surprise. But I will say it was kind of a fortunate one. I don't think that they had been thinking this, but like I said, during my poet laureateship, they were doing all this stuff about the transcontinental. And I think it does matter to have somebody who is half Chinese be actually poet laureate at that moment, because I can imagine a very different poem being written by somebody who did not have that interest in that particular history. And at the same time, Utah, like many places, was going through a lot of anti-Asian hate. And so I was able to use my platform to write in op-eds, sort of calling it out, which I thought, it made me feel like I was actually doing something good. And, the other thing about being poet laureate, this also speaks to Professor Dowd Arrow's comment or question, which is, you know, I was asked to write a poem for the vaccination volunteers and doctors. And, you know, that was really scary. You just realize that you're doing something for other people all the time. That's what being a poet laureate is. And I think people might imagine that being a poet laureate is about like, you're an awesome poet, but that doesn't mean that at all. I mean, they've selected you probably because they recognize you're interested and able and willing to do something for a larger community. And I actually say that that's been a great honor and a great experience for me. I don't know how many of you know Jason Reynolds, but he's the Library of Congress's youth writer laureates. And he basically said it right. He was like, you know, he's the young person's laureate. That's what it is. And he's like, you know, this is really a position that you do for other people's benefit. And he's like, you know, you serve at their pleasure. And I think that's really true. And that's why it's an honor to do it. Anyway. Is there any other question anyone else has? She says, sounding miserable on her couch.
I do encourage you guys to ask some more questions. You have a wonderful opportunity here, but I actually wonder if you would follow up for these students, Skyla's question, and maybe talk about the difference for you in writing a poem that is being called upon by others in the service. You talked about it, how it was harder. Can you contrast that to the writing of your own very personal or much more personal poetry?
Yeah, I could probably do that best by actually reading the difference between a poem that's for me versus a poem that's for other people. It'll take me a couple of seconds to find that poem. Let me see if I can do this really quickly. Oh my gosh, this is one of those classic moments where you're like, oh, I'll read you the poem that was written for somebody else, and then I'll read you a poem that I wrote for myself, if I can find one. And you'll definitely see a difference. You probably will prefer, most people probably will prefer the one that's written for other people because it's absolutely digging it. So let me see, poet laureate info and commission poems. Oh, goody. Okay. And I'll even put it on. I can share my screen. This is the good thing about this. Okay.
Technology.
Yay, technology. Every once in a while, it's not terrible. So this is what I was asked to write for the vaccination staff. And like I said, I was just terrified. I was just terrified because I thought this is, you know, writing something that's about an enormous, you know, historic event is not what you want to have to be responsible for. And they said, you know, they said they wanted to give this out in a little gift basket to like everybody who had volunteered to be part of this vaccination program. So doctors and nurses and you know, the staff that just move people through. And I said, could you just give them like a Bed Bath & Beyond certificate? I really think they would appreciate that more. And they're like, no, they really want, you know, something to really remember this day. So I agonized and agonized and agonized. And I finally came up with this poem where an idea, which is what happened, what did people think about just after the shot? Like, just what did they think about after that? And so I went and I interviewed all of these people and asked them. And then also sort of trolled Twitter to see what other people were saying after they got their, you know, shot. What we thought about just after the shot. Tuscany, perhaps, and haircuts, no longer baking casseroles twice a week or delivering groceries to someone else's family. The warm new weight of a cousin's baby or the clarifying light of an afternoon alone, the awkwardness of kisses and restaurants. I thought of my father as a child who almost died of polio, the nurse who berated him into relearning how to walk. I watched a woman in the chair beside me snap selfies, one man twisting in his seat as he tried to thank everyone. I'm flying home, someone murmured, in just a month. Some thought of funerals, some thought of sons that couldn't yet convince, or worried how much the side effects would cost. Perhaps some thought of burning forests of rhetoric and politicians, most likely considered something simpler, yet more complex, how gratitude was now a dictionary written in all the languages of the world. I thought of my husband and my mother's aging body, the scar on her upper arm I'd fingered as a child, pitted, pale, round as the moon, whose light, she said, I would see anywhere I traveled, linking her to me and us to everyone. And I'll find another poem that was written for somebody, just for me. But, like there is a moment in that poem that is to a certain extent understood to be written for a very particular audience. I think only people of a certain age will recognize that last scar on the arm. Younger people usually are like, what is that end? I don't even understand that end. But the vaccination scars for smallpox, tuberculosis, when you were younger, would actually cause a scar that looked like a moon. And I remember being fascinated by that scar on my mother's arm as a child. And so I remember when she said to me, like, you're going in to get your shots, I was like, am I going to get that? And she's like, no, they don't do it anymore. But I was fascinated by that visual marker that people would carry of a certain generation. And you'll still see it. I mean, look on your grandparents' arms, your parents' arms, and things like that. Well, maybe not your parents' arms, they're probably my age, but look for older people and they tend to have it. But I love that idea that, that's what a vaccination is, right? I mean, it's the idea that it's herd immunity that all of us eventually share in this kind of thing. Like we share in the light of the moon, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that was written for somebody else, but I wanted the language to be really clear and clean. I wanted to be very sort of quickly encapsulatable, but to get to also, I mean, I'm a pretty depressing person, I think. So I knew I couldn't do that. I knew this was a moment of happiness for a lot of people. They were just going to finally get out of the house. And what was funny to me now is that I share this poem now and people are like, ugh, kind of grumpy because like that didn't work. So that moment of happiness was very quickly sort of suppressed again.
The Delta poem.
Yeah, the Delta poem, which is psych anyway, but at that moment I wanted, people to feel happy. And so I was going for like that sort of triumphal moment. So let me try and find one just for myself that I wrote on myself. Oh my gosh. I have to go onto my own website.
While you're doing that, I just want to highlight for the students and invite them to think about some of the ways that Dr. Rekdal did try and work to, and I felt like personally succeeded in working in symbols that would connect across a vast distance, is particularly in that closing, and maybe you might not connect to that, but I definitely did the moment she mentioned it, because I had the same experience she did with my mother and my father's arms, and that symbol that was worn on their bodies. So maybe by noticing some of those things, you'll be able to better see the contrast that she's drawing out for you now.
What I would also say is it's a sort of cheap and easy trick, but it's a real one, which is oftentimes when we get to the end of a poem, we think we're supposed to say something huge and something really, really big. But oftentimes the end is within an image. It's within just something that allows the reader to hold something in their mind and see it and parse the differences. But now I'm going to show you another poem that doesn't really actually end in an image. This is one that was written for me, and this is a very personal one, because I was very close to my grandmother. I mean, my parents worked when I was a kid, so I was pretty much raised by my grandmother, and all my earliest memories are really of her. And she lived in Seattle, and she ended up having a brain tumor after she was diagnosed with it when she was age 100. And she was able to choose to die with dignity there. She knew that there was no kind of coming back from this. And I was able to spend a week with her before that decision was made. And so this is a poem called The Wolves. It was the week of asking to watch her eat, asking if she understood the doctor's questions, asking her to explain the difference between wanting to die right now and dying later. The tumor making certain answers unquestionable. I watched her point to the incense dish from which someone swept all the ashes up, asking if she recognized us, because that is what the living want, thinking it is a sign we have been loved. But the answer was a summer drive, a mountain, piles of leaves beneath which a wolf slept, suckling her cubs. Some deaths are good, and it makes them hard to grieve. She was, at times, in great pain. We wanted her to die too. That was important. But first, we wanted her to remember. From the bed, a finger pressed into a pile of leaves, gray haunch, unmovable ashes. I didn't want to disturb their tableau, she told us, and drifted off, and we did not know the meaning behind this. The wolves must have looked so comfortable to her, wordless, and in this wordlessness, perfect. Did she want to go there too? I could point to the image and say, my father must be in there, my uncle, or the wolf is you, you are still the mother, as if necessary to name that self at the end of its world. An animal cry, memory. That was our selfishness, as death was hers. She insisted upon it, and why not? It was good for me to get a chance to know you, she said, who had known me my entire life. Then the pills, a small handful crushed into juice. She was happy then. We all were, or said we were. What is the difference now? So you can tell, I think tonally, in terms of some of the complexity around its imagery, I try to keep this as quick and as simple as possible, even for myself, because I think there's so many sort of very complex feelings I was having for myself. I really needed a simple syntax to sort of carry me into or through some of the more complex emotions, which is, how is it that you can be happy for somebody who wants to die like this? And how does that still not relieve an incredible grief? And then also the frustration of when you ask for a more coherent memory you think is going to resolve your feelings about death, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to produce in them that sort of story. I mean, that was a story she told me. She just started talking about these wolves. And, you know, there's something surreal about the scene. There's something utterly real about the scene. And I tried to capture that. But you know, it's a much more unrelenting poem. I think it's you know, tonally ambiguous in ways that I knew writing for other people probably it shouldn't be. And if you ask me, I would say I preferred The Wolves 100% to the other poem, though I'm very proud of the other poem, because when you have to write an occasional poem, it's very difficult. So if you can write something you're like, that didn't suck, that, you know, it's okay. I felt that was a great triumph, you know, but I would never collect it. I would never publish it, you know, in a book. So.
So then would you say the public poem?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, would you call it a public poem versus how would you label it?
I think anything stuffed in a gift bag is going to be a public poem. Anything that literally comes with like a Snickers bar next to it, I'll call it a public poem. Though, I mean, I might have even like more reception to my work if I stuffed candy in with my other poems too. Like, here's a poem about my grandmother's death and a Reese's peanut butter cup.
Yeah, the revival of poetry in the 22nd century.
I know. Oh my gosh.
So is it too facile to ask which was the easier poem to write, if that's a word to associate?
No, it's, you know, facility. I love the poems that feel easy to write. The Wolves was easier to write because there was only 2 drafts of it, in the sense that I took one direction in a much more ornate way, and it felt dead to me on the page, but there was this this kernel where I dropped in a mention of wolves and this story of a wolf, which I never went anywhere with. And I suddenly was like, why isn't that the poem? And then so the second draft, I sat down and I was like, okay, so let's just tell this story about what she told me. And that came very quickly. And there was no pressure because it was only just my own self-generated pressure. You know, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as writers. I'm sure all the students feel that too. We feel incredible, audience, awareness, especially if we show our poems in workshop, and I still have a workshop. I still bring my poems all the time to remember what that's like. But also, there was just a bigger sense of pressure because, that I was asked to write a poem for other people. I was asked for the vaccination poem. I mean, there was a real sense that people, they were going to pay me for it. Like that was a thing. So no one was going to pay me for the wolves necessarily, and I would have been fine with that.
So the wolves was a 2 draft where you kind of found your gem and took it up later.
Mm-hmm.
What about the pandemic?
Oh, that was probably 5 or 6 drafts. Because I kept trying to figure out a way in. That's, for me, it's always a question of the form, rather than the subject. I had the subject. I knew what I was supposed to write, and I knew tonally what it had to be, which I didn't know going in with the wolves, though I did know it was going to be an elegy. But the elegy, even though grief is at the core of an elegy, there's different types of grief. There's resolved grief, there's unresolved grief, there is almost a sardonic, a humor that attaches itself to it. So there's many ways you can go, but the vaccination poem only had one way it had to go. It had to go happy. And I could bring in little moments of, let's remember that other people did not suffer the same way during this period of time. Like some people were actually, frontline workers, and some people lost people, and some people are still worried about taking this vaccine. So there are moments of that, but that couldn't be the whole poem. So yeah, I spent forever trying to figure out, okay, what is the frame to get me to that emotion and to get me via that subject? And when I just thought, wow, what if it's just what people thought afterwards? Then it was like, oh, that's so much easier. Yeah, it was very helpful.
Oh, how do you have a process for finding your way in? What I heard you describing is your revision process for a poem is discovering the way to tell the story that needs to be told.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I had a really good answer to this, but the God's honest truth, and I think almost every writer when pressed will say the exact same thing. You're not in control of how you find the form. The only thing that you can do is prepare by reading as widely as you can, by really it is by reading. It is just by constantly looking at as many different types of poems and books and book art projects as you can to sort of see how other people have approached it. But what normally happens is that your brain just sort of sparks and picks a piece of this and picks a piece of that and fuses them together. With West, I was really panicking there too, because I was like, I've got to write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. How in God's name can I cover everything from African-American porters' oral histories to, etiquette guidebooks to, Chinese, immigration law to, the story of prostitution in the West, all of these things are part of this project. Hollywood took this up. How do I do this? And I'd gone for a run. And this is one thing I would recommend. All of you who are writers, you should get a physical sport going, because you will answer all your questions doing that sport. I don't know what it is, but read as widely as you can and then go for a 10-mile run. And I swear to God, you'll have the answer to your question. Anyway, so I just come back from a run. I was standing in the shower, practically weeping, because I was like, eventually I'm going to have to come up with this poem to present at this, big thing. And then I remember just thinking, what about those Angel Island poems again? So I dried my hair off and I went and I looked at the Angel Island poems, and I just happened to find this poem, the frame poem that I showed you. And in it, it actually had a word terrace. And what was funny about it is that there's this dead transcontinental railroad line very close to my house. And there's a ghost town called Terrace. And I was like, done. Done. That's it. I just use every character or a pair of characters, and each one opens up into a different poem about the railroad, and then all together they become a translation, both of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Transcontinental. And then I was like, I'm a genius. Let's go home. So I was, yeah, but it was just pure dumb luck.
Some luck and a lot of research, it sounds like, too, just looking into new, just keep picking and looking.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would recommend if you're a student and you're writing and you feel like you've hit a wall. There's so many oral archives out there for almost any subject you can imagine. There's artwork for all. I find that one of the things that has been a really rich source of inspiration for me is museums, archives, zoos, going and looking at watching people watch animals is endlessly fascinating, as well as watching animals. Oftentimes we think we have to write about ourselves, but oftentimes we write best about ourselves when we're writing about something else. And it surprises us into an insight that we didn't know we held about ourselves, about the world, about what we want to believe. So freeing yourself up to write about the rest of the world, actually, you're going to write about yourself far more than you would ever imagine.
I think that's an excellent point. We have just 4 minutes left with Dr. Rekdal. If anyone has any questions, this is a great opportunity.
About anything at this point.
Yes.
Very nice.
Well, Dr. Rekdal, if you, as you are also a professor and a teacher of writing and poetry, if there was one thing to tell to this group in particular today, besides go explore as you just did, what would it be?
Relax. I think a lot of people feel like they have to produce something great all the time, and they have to produce something great early. I think we're a society that is obsessed with productivity. And I think it's important to just give yourself a bit of a break. I often, in my own workshops, I tell students, I'm giving you too much to write. I'm making you write a poem a week, which means that you're going to write a lot of terrible stuff. And in fact, if you did write a good poem a week, that would be weird. That would be very weird. You're probably going to write one good poem a month, maybe two. And that's fine. And that I want people to sort of get over the idea that writing is precious, that, the writing of a poem or any piece of literature is just mostly crap until you understand what it is you're doing and trying to achieve. And then you can go back and suddenly go, okay, this is what's important. This is the area that needs to be focused in on. So this is a good way to get to Skylar's question. What is your favorite part of writing a poem? For me, my favorite part of writing a poem, there's two favorite parts. My most favorite part is actually editing. And my second favorite part, because by that time I know what I'm doing. I kind of know what I want to say. So I know what needs to be kept and what can go. My other favorite part is when I'm writing and I lose my self-consciousness and I don't know where I'm going and I don't know what I'm saying. And I'm surprised into something. That's my other favorite part. And it's so addictive. And it's hard you can't do it all the time. It's actually a fairly rare thing. But when it happens, it's amazing. And I would say about 99.9% of the time when it does happen, that ends up being a poem I end up keeping.
Keeping at one draft?
No, not at one draft, but keeping in terms of that's a poem that I'll come back to work on. Yeah. So do you think that part is from what your youthful desire to be an editor? Maybe not. I don't know. I think most writers like editing because I think writing with a blank page is so kind of not terrifying or intimidating, but just sort of, I guess maybe, yeah, just intimidating. I think it is a little intimidating to work with nothing. But when you have something, it's a game. It becomes like an invitation to play with something that's already there. And it's harder to play when you produce all of the things to be played with. So that's it. Well, I think we're done. Thank you, Skyla. If it weren't for you, there would be nothing, pretty much nothing here.
She's carried the session.
Thank you, Skyla.
Well, thank you, Skyla, and thank you, Dr. Rekdal. Dr. Paisley Rekdal, Poet Laureate of Utah. She will be reading for us also by webinar this evening and sharing more of her work. So please return. If you're not on Bainbridge campus, you can return via webinar. And if you are on Bainbridge campus, please join us in person and we can all sit together and hopefully ask a lot more questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated this.
Much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.